Poštovane dame i gospodo, cijenjeni uzvanici, srdačno vas pozdravljam u ovoj prekrasnoj secesijskoj zgradi u kojoj djeluje Hrvatski državni arhiv. Pozdravljam vas na Međunarodnom simpoziju Prisjećanje na 914. promišljanje o nasljeđu Prvog svjetskog rata. Dozvolite mi da na samom početku pozdravim ministricu kulture Republike Hrvatske Andreju Zlatar Violić, zatim prvu potpredsjednicu Vlade Republike Hrvatske i ministricu vanjskih i europskih poslova Vesnu Pusić i njezinu ekscelenciju gospođu Michelle Bocoz, veleposlanicu Francuske u Zagrebu. Također bih željela pozdraviti i sve predstavnike diplomatskog zbora u Hrvatskoj koji su danas ovdje prisutni, kao i predstavnike organizatora samog simpozija, dakle predstavnike UNICE. Upravo ste slušali prvi stavak Čelo sonate opus 35 hrvatske skladateljice Dore Pejačević u izvođenju ansambla Tris. I na samom početku dozvolite mi da pozovem sada njenu ekscelenciju gospođu Michelle Bocoz u ime organizatora da se obrati skupu.
Mrs. First Deputy, Vice Minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Minister of Cultures, dear colleagues and friends ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the UNIC network in Croatia and the auspices and with the support of the Ministry of Culture of the Republic of Croatia, in scientific partnership with historians of the University of Zagreb and the non-governmental organizations Documenta and Youth Initiative for Human Rights, I'm very honored to open here in Zagreb this international symposium on the Great War Centennial. UNIC Croatia is the network of European National Institutes for Culture established in Croatia. Founded 8 years ago, it gathers Austrijski Kulturni Forum, British Council, Goethe Institut Croatian, Instituto Camões, Instituto Cervantes, Institut Français, which actually holds the presidency, Instituto Italiano di Cultura, and for the first time this year, Hrvatska Kuća and Wallonie-Bruxelles International. Through its activities, UNIC Network aims at promoting European values and contributing to cultural diversity inside and outside the EU. UNIC's mission is to expand the role of culture in Europe and to strengthen cultural dialogue, exchange, and sustainable cooperation worldwide. This is why this commemoration represents an opportunity for all of us as Europeans to reflect on the use of history, not as revisiting the disputes that divided the nations, but as a means to consolidate peace and reconciliation, the very foundation of our common European identity. I'm also sure that thanks to this remarkable project, the terms of historical debate and the state of knowledge will be reinforced and that it will contribute to awake vocations among young researchers. For each part of Europe, it is still even today a complex task to understand all the contrasting views linked to the memories and remembrance of this war, a turning point for the whole continent which shaped our destiny. François Feuilletot, a great historian and a great European humanist, devoted all his life to convey, in France, the country he chose to live in, his knowledge of Central Europe, which he beloved so much. This historian, who has qualified himself as un passager du siècle, always remembered 1914 in Zagreb. As a little 5-year-old boy, he witnessed the patriotic enthusiasm expressed at Turk Ban Jelačić in Zagreb, which was repeated in so many other squares of our continent. And then he witnessed this time of sorrow, for him also with the loss of his mother and the catastrophe that ensued for all Europeans. The First World War shaped Croatia's destiny, as well as that of all the other European nations. The commemoration of the centenary is without any doubt a unique moment to realize that today's European citizen is still affected by this conflict. The symposium in Zagreb is not about questions of responsibility for the conflict. It's an opportunity to debate openly the act of commemoration of the war in order to get a better understanding of our common European identity. The memories, the representations, the account of the conflict, the process of reconciliation, the war legacy and remembrance as a part of building a new Europe. The 20th century conflicts that raged throughout Europe resulted in the collective determination to make peace and reconciliation a foundation of the European identity. This symposium will reflect the new tools at our disposal to think about the conflicts in Europe. The exceptional quality of the contributors, all of them distinguished historians and researchers, will enable us to consider this upheaval and breaking point in our European history and how it still resonates today. I would like to express my gratitude to all participants in this symposium, to the ministers, Mrs. Pusic and Mrs. Latov-Jolic, for your strong interest and your investment and your support in this project, the Director of the National Archives, Mrs. Vlatka Limic, and the archivist, Mr. Filipovic, the professors Drago Roksandic, Jakovina, and Johan Chaputo for providing scientific consultations. And very special thanks to the organizer, to Luc Lévy, and Joat Zifra, and Perrine Grunewald from the French Institute, whose commitment has contributed, I think, to launching this event, and I'm sure it will be a great success. Thank you very much to all of you. Thanks for your attention.
Zamolila bih sada ministricu kulture Republike Hrvatske, gospođu Andreju Zlatar-Violić, da se obrati skupu.
Poštovana prva potpredsjednice vlade i ministrice vanjskih poslova, gospođo Pusić, poštovane ekscelencije na čelu sa gospođom Michelle Bocoz, koja predsjedava mrežom UNICA, mrežom europskih kulturnih instituta koji su ovdje u Zagrebu doista omogućili današnji skup. Želim se na početku zahvaliti svim onima kolegama iz struke, sa sveučilišta, iz različitih instituta, iz ovog i drugih arhiva koji su pristali sudjelovati i dati dio svojih istraživanja kao doprinos zajedničkom promišljanju nasljeđa Prvoga svjetskog rata. Doista hvala svima i mogu reći jedino da nam je čast što u ovoj zgradi koja je i sama nedavno slavila jednu od obljetnica, možemo promisliti o onome što je za nas značilo stoljeće rata, što je za Europu značilo stoljeće rata. Za nas, naime, koji živimo u ovoj regiji, možemo si postaviti jedno neugodno i teško pitanje. Nije li na jedan način koji nije paradoksalan, nego se njemu upravo historiografski treba razmišljati? Stoljeće rata, 20. stoljeće, počelo ovdje i završilo sa ratovima 90-ih, od jednog Sarajeva do drugog Sarajeva. To je pitanje koje nas vraća na samo ishodište kojim ćemo danas početi, koji nas vraća i na pitanje zašto i iz kojih razloga je Prvi svjetski rat u istraživanjima, barem u ovoj regiji, bio često zanemaren. I ako nešto postoji kao temeljna svrha današnjeg simpozija, je da potakne istraživače da rade dalje, ali i da dalje od tog istraživanja njihovi rezultati, njihova promišljanja uđu u udžbenike, uđu u jednu vrstu općega znanja, jer stare su generacije govorile po kućama, u obiteljima, kako se radi o velikom ratu. Zatim je došao slijed obrazovanja gdje su srednje generacije naučile nešto, onu klasičnu, dosta često krivu razliku između uzroka i povoda rata, pa smo učili o Gavrilu Principu kao revolucionaru. A zatim su došla desetljeća kada zapravo o Prvome svjetskom ratu ovdje nismo dovoljno učili. I mislim da je ova prilika da svi zajedno, ali temeljem onih koji najviše znaju i koji su, ja mislim, više od desetljeća već uložili u svoje istraživanja, da počnemo od početka, od onoga kako je uopće do samoga rata došlo, što znači da krenemo od samoga početka 20. stoljeća. Za Hrvatsku je posebno važno i nije ni čudno da su organizatori ovoga skupa, koji su prvenstveno europski kulturni instituti, među njima i novoosnovana Hrvatska kuća, koja je možda ovo jedan od prvih javnih nastupa, da su u ovaj simpozij ugradili velik dio nasljeđa koji pripada kulturi. Ne samo zato što mi nismo bili fronta, nismo bili prostor bojišnice, nego zato što su odjeci toga rata živjeli i žive u našoj književnosti, u našoj glazbi, u našem slikarstvu. Od Dore Pejačević, koju ste slušali, preko Miroslava Krleže, do jedne od slikarica Naste Rojco, koje će se govoriti u zadnjoj sesiji sutra poslijepodne. U ovome su, i moram još jednom poimence zahvaliti, sudjelovali posebno različiti, ali doista različiti subjekti i partneri, od spomenutih ambasada, instituta i Nacionalnog arhiva. Prije svega treba istaknuti Odsjek za povijest Filozofskog fakulteta u Zagrebu i naravno dva partnera koji pripadaju trećemu sektoru, civilnome društvu, Inicijativi mladih za mir i Dokumenti. Mislim da je upravo taj spoj garancija da ovo što će se ova 2 dana diskutirati, o čemu ćemo razmišljati i što će ostati zapisano možda u nekoj knjizi ili na snimkama, neće biti samo sveučilišna diskusija, što nam često zamjeraju, nego će biti doista pravi povod za refleksiju o prošlosti koja za nas zapravo znači refleksiju o budućnosti. Živimo u ujedinjenoj Europi, radimo na pokušaju da se naše kulture ne samo razumiju, nego jedne među drugima prepoznaju. Ne da se identificiraju, nego da se prepoznaju. Upravo ove teme, one su koje označuju unutar 100 godina naš zajednički korijen. Još jednom hvala svima i posebno veliko hvala istraživačima koji su posvetili svoj rad da bismo mi danas mogli ovdje nešto doista naučiti. Hvala lijepo.
Zahvaljujem. A sada bih najavila već i prvo izlaganje. Gospodin Christopher Clark, Sveučilište Cambridge i njegovo izlaganje The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914. Please.
Vrlo sam sretan što mogu biti u Zagrebu. Ovo je moj prvi posjet vašem lijepom gradu. To je sve što znam reći na hrvatskom, pa ću nastaviti na engleskom. Well, I thought I'd begin, I hope that's okay, with a few images. Now, I know that in this part of the world you don't need to be reminded of the events of the 28th of June 1914, but I thought there's an inexhaustible interest about the drama of that day, the 28th of June, and I thought we'd just look at a couple of pictures before I start to refresh our memories of what happened on that day. I want to begin with a picture of a couple who are about to have what I think we could fairly describe as a bad day. He is Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the Austrian throne. She is Sophie Chotek, the descendant of a great Bohemian lineage, not great enough to qualify as appropriate material for the Habsburg royal family, for which reason she was never allowed to sit in the golden carriage, the royal carriage with its golden wheels, or to sit beside her husband at Habsburg court events. A very frustrating feature of their lives together, that they couldn't live as a couple in public. That was not permitted by Habsburg etiquette. But of course, Sarajevo, being on the edge of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, was a place where the usual rules didn't really apply, and that meant that she could officiate beside her husband. She insisted on doing this because, of course, the 28th of June, in addition to being Vidovdan, in addition to being St. Vitus's Day, a very important red-letter day in the Serbian national calendar, was also their wedding anniversary. So she insisted on being with him during that day and anticipating the kind of joint officiations that would become their lives, that their lives would involve once he came to the throne. An event which was surely imminent because the reigning Kaiser, Franz Josef, as you know, was already very elderly. And here we see a picture of Franz Ferdinand and his entourage. They're just not far from the Sarajevo railway station. And I just would draw your attention to, I don't know if I have a laser pen here. No, I don't. Yes, I do. Do I? Is that right? Nope, that's definitely not right. Oh dear, sorry, can I have the technical person again? I thought it was a laser pen, but it wasn't. I pressed this thing here. Okay, we don't need the laser pen. Is there a laser pen? Oh, there is one. Oh, that's down there, laser. It actually says laser too. There you are, you see. I'm not technically very skillful. Okay, I would just draw your attention to the beautiful feathers hanging from their helmets. Green ostrich feathers. You can't tell that they're green because this is a black and white photograph, but more on those ostrich feathers in a moment. This is just a map. You don't, in this room, really need to see this map. In England, it's always useful to take people back into the Balkans because nobody understands where the Balkans are or what's in them. But here, of course, you know that. But the key point about this map is that on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, we see the differences, the very speedy transformation that was occurring in the Balkans in the last few years before 1914, above all the expansion of Serbia. You see the drastic expansion. There more than 100% increase in the territorial extent of Serbia, but Bulgaria too changes its shape, so does Greece, and with an inaudible plop, Albania suddenly appears in 1913. So this is a period of extremely rapid transformation, and I think that's an important point to remember when we think about the events that brought war in 1914. The final point is just to draw attention to how intimately connected Belgrade is with the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. It's almost on the border. It's a few minutes' drive from Belgrade into Austro-Hungarian territory, and that tells you something about the intimacy, the closeness of what had become a very toxic relationship between the Habsburg monarchy and the Kingdom of Serbia by 1914. Now, this is the nearest that the early 20th century got to Google Earth. It's an image from the Baedeker travel guide, and it's an aerial picture of Sarajevo. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room knows Sarajevo, but the point is simply that this is a city organized around a river, and as you know, the cars, as they entered the city, moved along the Apel Quay, moving eastwards across the city towards the city hall, which is over here, the Rathaus, over here. And that was, of course, where the Archduke and his wife met with various dignitaries. This is a picture which I admire because of its brutal simplicity. It captures the events, as you can see, as the cars pass along the Apel Quay, just near the Chumuria Bridge. A young man called Nedeljko Čabrinović throws his bomb. It's a grenade manufactured in the Kragujevac arsenal. The bomb misses the car and explodes under the third car, injuring the people inside, but not killing Franz Ferdinand or his wife, or even, she is cut slightly on the face, but apart from that, she's fine. At this point, you might have thought it was time to call off the visit to Sarajevo, and this was suggested to Franz Ferdinand, but he was a very irritable man at the best of times, and he replied, "Don't be ridiculous. The man is clearly insane. He should be sent to the asylum. The tour will go on, the visit will go on as planned." And so everybody got back into their cars. The cars at the back drove around the destroyed car number 3, and the motorcade continued in the direction of the Rathaus. What happened next? It was a sort of a bunch of meetings with dignitaries at the Rathaus, and the man I most pity in this picture, the man I have most sympathy for, is Mehmet Čurčić, whose job was to give a speech of welcome. I mean, this is a marvelous image because it's a very helpful reminder, especially when you're in Britain and you're talking to British audiences, of the Bosnian Muslim character of Sarajevo. The urban elite was a largely Muslim elite, and you can see this on the fezzes of the gentlemen who are greeting the royal couple. And Mehmet Čurčić, who was then the mayor of Sarajevo, had the task of welcoming the couple. And he had prepared a rather marvelous speech, but the speech was now totally inappropriate because a bomb had been thrown, and his speech began with the words, he was too nervous to change his speech, he was a nervous man at the best of times, and so he started reading his speech, which was now completely inappropriate. It began with the words, "It is with sentiments of the deepest joy that the citizens of Sarajevo welcome your majesties. Your highnesses, I'm sorry." And halfway through this first sentence, Franz Ferdinand, irritable as ever, interrupted him and said, "Joy, welcome, is this how you welcome guests to your city? With bombs?" Whereupon Sophie Chotek leaned towards him, whispered something to him, which history will never know what exact words she used, but we can presume what she was saying was something like, "It's not his fault, let him continue." And he then said, "Very well, you may go on." These are moments that occur in every marriage. And the speech continued, the Archduke replied, they got into their car, and what happened next, you all know. There's a very fanciful image from Le Petit Journal, a marvelous Parisian journal, whose images are used everywhere in history books on this period, not because they're accurate, but because they're beautiful. I mean, that's a magnificent image. It's completely inaccurate because the couple did not rise up like a couple in an opera saying, "I die." It wasn't like that. They simply remained seated exactly as they had been. The shots were so deadly, the two shots hit their marks so effectively. The first one went into his collar and severed the jugular vein. The second one went deep into her abdomen, severing a large vein too. He didn't, incidentally, Gavrilo Princip did not intend to shoot the Archduchess. He wanted to shoot Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but the crowd was already trying to restrain him. The shot went wide, it was deflected by the door of the vehicle, and it struck the Duchess instead. And the point is that she was hit in such a vital place that she was in coma by the time the car managed to reverse and make its way back down the Appel Quay. They did not stand up like that, they remained seated. In fact, it was unclear to the bodyguard, Count Harrach, that either of them had been hurt. So immobile were they. But as the car moved off, she fell sideways onto his lap, and he was heard to say the words that would become famous throughout the monarchy and throughout the world within the next 24 hours, namely, "Zofall, Zofall, sterbe nicht, bleib am Leben für unsere Kinder." Sophie, Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children. Very important words because they opened up the private life of this couple, something which had been unknown to the Austro-Hungarian public, was made known, the intimate, very happy quality of their private life, despite the rather rebarbative persona, the rather difficult and irritable persona of this man in public life. So they were dead by about 25 minutes later, and here we see a picture which is often captioned as the arrest of Gavrilo Princip. Of course, it's not the arrest of Gavrilo Princip. It's the arrest of a man called Ferdinand Beer a couple of days later as part of a police dragnet to round up the usual suspects in Sarajevo. But in fact, the man who made the photograph did a marvelous and brilliant thing. Of course, it would have been astonishing if somebody had taken a photograph of Gavrilo Princip's arrest. I mean, given the state of photographic technology at the time, quite impossible to imagine. But the point is, he had received a tip-off from the police. There's going to be an arrest at such and such an address. He went to that address, he took this photo, and then he did something absolutely brilliant. He marketed the photo as a photograph of the arrest of Gavrilo Princip, of the young assassin, and he made a fortune. This photo was syndicated across the world press and is still seen in many history books as an image of the arrest of Princip. But what's interesting about it is that you can see that this young man is being arrested by Austrian officials, but at the same time having to be protected from angry Sarajevo Bosnian Muslims who were very, who were at that point involved in anti-Serb violence and so on following the assassinations, because the Bosnian Muslims were very pro-Habsburg. They were pro-Habsburg loyalists. They saw the Habsburgs as their protectors, and there was a corresponding wave of Serbophobia across the city following the assassination. So this man had to be protected from the crowd, although he himself was not a Serb. Here's a picture of the young man who carried out the assassination. And here is, this is Gavrilo Princip, a native of Western Bosnia, from a very poor part of Western Bosnia, Obljaj, a tiny hamlet in very harsh terrain, difficult place to make a living today, as it was then. And here are his co-conspirators. The key point about these young men is, first of all, that they were very young. A couple of them were really just schoolboys. In fact, Gavrilo Princip was himself too young to be executed under Austrian law. He had not yet reached his majority. He was under 20. The key point to make about them is that these were not terrorists in the sense in which we mean the word today. They were not cruel. They did not wish to kill people for fun. They didn't wish to cause indiscriminate carnage. They were not interested in blowing up shops and cafes, this kind of thing. They were state terrorists. Their violence was focused on the carriers of state authority. And they were young, they were rich in ideals, but very poor in experience. You think of the words of Bogdan Jerajic, the suicide assassin who took his own life in 1910 when he tried to shoot the Croatian governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Varešanjin. He wrote in his diary, "I want to burn like a torch for my people." And this was the kind of passion for the sort of cult of self-sacrifice, death for the nation, that was characteristic of all these young men, who had been groomed and politicized. In particular, Princip and his two colleagues, Čabrinović and Grabej, had been politicized, radicalized through their contact with the networks, both Bosnia, the networks of Mlada Bosna, but much more importantly, the networks in Belgrade, where they all spent a considerable time. And here's a picture of the man known as Apis, Dragutin Dimitrijević, chief of Serbian military intelligence. The key point to make about the link between Serbia and these assassinations is that there is no link between the Serbian state and these assassinations. You cannot say that the Serbian government as such was responsible. On the other hand, you can say that Serbian state agents were involved in the planning of this and other assaults on the Austro-Hungarian elites. So much for the background to the actual assassinations. But that leaves us with a problem, because on the morning of the arrival of Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo, we know that, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, we know that Europe was at peace. And if you had asked the great majority of, or in fact all of them I think, of the most important statesmen in Europe at that time, how likely they thought a major European war was in the near future, they would all have told you very unlikely. In fact, they would have told you that war had been becoming less likely in recent months and years rather than more likely. After all, Europe had made it through two major Balkan wars, very violent and very bloody wars, whose violence and force should not be underestimated. These are the so-called wars before the war. There was a very good conference about them in Bonn just quite recently, and had managed to make it through these Balkan crises without a major conflagration. That made peace look almost future-proof, and it's important not to forget that. So one of the most eloquent testimonies to this sense of security is that of Arthur Nicholson, a senior functionary of the Foreign Office in London, who remarked at the end of May 1914, he remarked, "Since all the years that I have been at the Foreign Office, I have never seen such calm international waters." That's the end of May 1914. Not one of the starry hours of diagnostic prognosis, of diplomatic diagnostic prognosis. But of course, as you know, 37 days later, Europe was indeed at war, and the war that unfolded from this European war would become what German historians have, I think, rightly described as the Urkatastrophe, the primal catastrophe of the 20th century. The previous speakers have spoken of the way in which this war disfigured the 20th century before it had scarcely begun. This war would consume three empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire would all go down in this war. Much more importantly, it consumed the lives of at least, we don't have good global statistics, but at least 10 million young men on its numerous fields of conflict. It accounted for between 15 and 21 million seriously wounded men, and many of these wounds were life-changing wounds whose effects were felt throughout the lives of the men who suffered them. And many of you will have had relatives or remember relatives who are still suffering from the effects of these wounds, even in extreme old age. I certainly did, because this being a global war also involved Australia in a very, very deep and important way. In other words, this is, I think, as the German emigre American historian Fritz Stern has put it, this was the disaster from which all the disasters of the 20th century sprang. It is difficult to imagine without this war the rise of fascism in Italy. It's difficult to imagine the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution in the Russian Empire. It's easy to imagine the February Revolution it's easy to imagine a collapse of Tsarism, a takeover of power by a sort of liberal nationalist coalition of centrist interests. Virtually everybody had predicted something like that in Russia, but nobody had predicted the Bolshevik coup, the creation of a one-party state, and the Russian Civil War that followed, consuming a further 5 million lives in its wake. And of course, no one had imagined the Stalinist aftermath that would come. It's difficult to imagine the rise of National Socialism in Germany without the First World War. A lot of recent writing on Nazism has stressed the formative character of the First World War as an event that profoundly destabilized and disorganized German society, making new political combinations possible and bringing a kind of politics that had been at home only on the margins of German politics into the center. The impact of this war is scarcely measurable, especially in that society, for reasons we don't have time to go into. In other words, I think my former colleague at Cambridge, now at the University of Yale, who's written a book on this subject, is right when he speaks of the First World War as having unhinged, that's the word he uses, unhinged the global system. He argues that it destabilized, that it disorganized global politics with consequences that lasted deep into the 20th century, and we're still living with some of those consequences. So the question of how all this came about, it follows from all of that the question of how all of this came about possesses a certain intrinsic interest. Now, I don't want to disappoint you, but I'm not the first person to have noticed that. This has been a long debate. In fact, in many ways, the debate is older than the war itself, because it began before the first shots were fired. It's fascinating to see how many of the arguments that you find in the literature on the outbreak of this war, you can find on the lips of the statesmen who brought this war into the world, as they all pointed the finger at each other and found quite sophisticated historical arguments to justify their own behavior and to condemn the behavior of their respective opponents and colleagues. In 1991, when the American historian John Langdon did a count of the literature, he estimated that there were 25,000 books and articles that one really ought to read if one wanted to master this debate. And when one thinks of Rebecca West, who traveled to Sarajevo, she's the author, I think, of one of the deepest reflections on the place of the Balkans in 20th century European history, not, of course, a historian, strictly speaking. And this book is not just a book of history, it's a book of memoir, travelogue, diary. It's many, many personal narratives of personal relationships, but it's an absolutely wonderful book, Black Lamb, Grey Falcon. And when she visited Sarajevo to see the place where she felt the spark had been thrown that ignited Europe, she went to the Sarajevo Rathaus, to the Sarajevo City Hall. She climbed the stairs with her husband Paul, or one of her husbands, Paul, ascended the balcony, and they stood on the balcony where Franz Ferdinand had stood and had looked out over this very handsome city. And she turned to her husband and she said, "I shall never understand how it all happened. It's not that we know too little, it's that we know too much." And that was in 1937. Well, today we know a great deal more. And so then the question arises, why add another book? Why bother to try once again to visit this theme? And this, of course, is a question that colleagues of mine in Cambridge often asked me when they learned that I was working on this subject. I remember one colleague saying to me, "Surely this has been done to death." And I think this is a characteristic of one's colleagues, that just in the moment when you're struggling with the cruelties of a really difficult topic, they come up with excellent reasons why you should just curl up and die. But of course, there's an answer to this question, and that is that the debate is old. Of course, it's very old, it's over 100 years old, but the subject is nonetheless still fresh. In fact, in many ways, it's fresher than it was 30 or 40 years ago, and this is the mystery of 1914 as a theme, and it's not just fresh because of the 100-year anniversary. That really has nothing to do with it. It's fresher than it was when I first encountered it in the 1970s as a schoolboy in Sydney. When I first read about this subject, a certain amount of what you call period charm had accumulated around the events of 1914. People spoke of Europe's last summer. I mean, more recently a book appeared with that title by David Fromkin, but there was a lot of tennis and waltzing going on in the Europe of 1914. If you read the books of Barbara Tuchman, wonderful books, the Guns of August and the Proud Tower, you read these books, they were full of very detailed descriptions of uniforms, of the gala menus at big dinners, of state etiquette, of court etiquette, of rules about where babies could be presented in their prams during court occasions. And the more you read of these details, the more you read about the ornamentalism of this world of 1914, the more you felt that if these people's, I mean, I'm thinking, just to give you an example, there's a marvelous description of Lord Salisbury riding to the House of Commons through Hyde Park on London's first pneumatically tired tricycle, pushed by his butler, James. And the more you read of this lovingly described detail, the more you read of this sort of stuff, the more the assumption asserted itself that if these people's hats and helmets had green ostrich feathers on them, then perhaps their thoughts, dreams, and arguments also had green ostrich feathers. In other words, perhaps these were people of a bygone era, people shut off in a distant past like ancient Egypt, people who could no longer speak to us directly. And yet, if we look again at these very same events, not from the perspective of the Cold War in the 1970s, but from the perspective of today, of the early-ish 21st century, then you can't help but be struck by the raw modernity of the events of the 28th of June. They begin not with prancing horses and wagons, but with a motorcade, a long line of automobiles. And if you run through the events of the 28th of June, you can't help but have flickering in the back of your mind the pictures of Dallas in November 1963. They began with a squad of suicide bombers, and these young men were suicide bombers in a very literal, narrow sense. They were carrying not just guns and bombs, but paper twists of potassium cyanide powder, and they'd been instructed to take their own lives after they carried out their mission. And it's important not to forget, it's part of the story of their dedication and their courage, that both Princip and Chabrinovich tried to kill themselves after the assassination, after Chabrinovich had thrown his bomb and Princip had fired his shots. But the poison was of bad quality. It simply burned the linings of their stomachs. It didn't kill them. Then, of course, behind these young men were underground networks, which were trans-territorial in character, could not be linked in any clear-cut way to any sovereign entity, mysterious underground networks animated by a cult of death, sacrifice, and revenge. And there are other ways in which our compass has shifted, our perspective has shifted on these events. First of all, there's the fact, and that was referred to in your very interesting words of introduction, that the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s have reminded us of the potency of nationalism in an environment with many ethnicities living close together. And it's less obvious now. I mean, one of the strangest features of the literature on the outbreak of this war is that in the great majority of studies, not all, but in the great majority of studies, the Balkans are completely invisible. They're simply not part of the picture at all. And it seems to me that it makes less sense to do that now that we understand that the potency of the relationships among these peoples. Then there's the potential potency of the relationships. And then there's the fact that, we're no longer living in the era of bipolar stability of the Cold War. We're living in an era which in many ways more and more resembles the moment of 1914. This is an era with a weary Titan. In 1914, people spoke of the weary giant, Great Britain. Today, some people detect signs of weariness in Washington. It's an era of rising powers which are challenging the world pecking order. And I'm not just, a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, I would have been thinking just of China. But of course, there's more than one rising power now to contend with, or power that is once again rising. It's an era of numerous regional crises, some of which involve great power interests. It's a world, in other words, which more and more resembles 1914. So there's a paradox about the events of that year, namely that even as they recede further and further into the past in terms of calendar time, in some respects, they are also coming closer to us in terms of what they can say to us, how freshly they speak to us. And these shifts in perspective prompt us to rethink the story of how war came to Europe. And adopting or accepting that challenge does not mean, and I really want to stress this, it does not mean embracing a vulgar presentism that remakes the past to fit the needs, political or aesthetic or whatever, of the present. Rather, it means acknowledging that there are features of the past of which we now have a better view because our vantage point has shifted. There's a difference between those two things. And bearing all of this in mind, and I only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to keep this very brief. Bearing all of this in mind, how does one refresh the narrative of events like this, especially a narrative which has been worked over by so many gifted historians, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of them over the fullness of a century. And in suggesting how one can do this, I want to dwell just on a couple of points. Of course, one has to do many things, but I want to touch just on a couple of key points. The first thing I personally tried to do was, rather than changing the answer, I tried to change a little bit the question. Instead of asking the question, why did this war come about, which is the question at the heart of the literature on the origins of the First World War, I was interested in how this war came about. How did peace become war? Now, of course, questions of why and how are not really separable. Ultimately, they're logically interconnected. But they lead us in different directions. Questions about why lead us towards a list of remote causes, of categorical causes. We end up with a list of factors: nationalism, imperialism, arms races, social Darwinist ideology. And as one piles up these causes, an optical illusion develops. It's an optical illusion that this war has to come. The tongue of the scales shifts from a possible war to a likely war to an inevitable war. And what happens then is that the agency of those statesmen who made the choices and decisions that brought this war into the world are squeezed out of view, out of the field of vision. And we're left with a war to which there was no alternative. Now, this, of course, was the argument of the statesmen themselves. They all claimed, and politicians will always do this, with apologies to politicians who might be in this room, politicians are experts at explaining why what they're doing is the only and inevitable outcome of their analysis of policy, of the problem that they're dealing with. But that doesn't mean that we should accept their perspective, because in fact, a great deal of the best recent writing on the outbreak of war in 1914 has suggested that there are many reasons for seeing this war as being less probable in the last months before 1914 rather than more. And I'm thinking of Holger Afflerbach's wonderful collection, 1914, The Improbable War, which shows that there are many features of the pre-1914 environment that hinted at a gradual resolution of Europe's conflicts. And then there's Friedrich Kiesling's book on détente, which shows that the periods of détente, which are such a strange feature of the pre-war world, Europe had long periods of lull, not just periods of conflict and crisis, but also periods of lull and relaxation. And Kiesling says these periods are not a sort of brief truce, they're not a brief interruption of the road to war. They represent, or they demonstrate, the authentic capacity of the international system to produce peace and détente as well as conflict and crisis. And there's a second problem with the question why, and that was a problem addressed by a Bulgarian historian of the Balkan Wars, who made the comment, and I found it so useful that I'm going to quote it. He said, "As soon as we pose the question why, guilt soon becomes the focal point." In other words, what he was saying was that the question why is often a cover for the question who. When we ask why, what we really meant is, who did this? Who brought this terrible war into the world? And of course, the most popular suspect in the literature has been the German Empire, especially since the extremely influential works by Fritz Fischer, who in the 1960s produced a sequence of books, initially not particularly concerned with the origins of this war, but more and more focusing on a German, not only on the German role in single-handedly bringing about the war, but also on German planning for war, which he argued, he went further than to say the Germans caused the war. He said the Germans planned the war long in advance. And since then, Germany has been the most popular candidate for this kind of thing. And what you do if you end up wanting to blame a particular state is you collect a sort of charge sheet against that state. It changes the whole methodology. It means you focus on a suspect, then you collect Beweismaterial, as the Germans call it, material proof, and you until you have a case for the prosecution, and then you condemn. You say, that's it. We know who did. We started off suspecting who did it. Now we've shown how they did it, and now we have the answer. We know the answer to why. So in other words, you start answering the why question, only then do you move to the how question. I wanted to do it the other way around. I wanted to first to ask, how did war come about? What are the decisions that bring war into the world? And only then to ask the question, who made these decisions? What kinds of conclusions can we draw about responsibility once we know how the war came about? Okay, so that's the most important point, and I just want to touch, I've got about 3 minutes, so I want to touch just very briefly on what else one can do. Of course, one can capture trends in the literature. This is an extremely diverse and very mobile literature. The picture of what happened in 1914 is still not consensual among historians. There are many disagreements, but there are also many interesting trends. And one of them is a globalization of the field of vision. Historians of the pre-war no longer see the outbreak of this war solely as the result of European concerns. There's more and more sensitivity to the way in which states like China, for example, feed into this story. The Chinese question did a great deal to stir hostility and distrust between Britain, Germany, Russia, and France in the pre-war years, especially from the 1890s. And there's a lot of very interesting recent work which has shown how the British foreign policy was much less focused on Germany than we think. The British were much more concerned about Russia than has often been recognized. And right through until the summer of 1914, here's a really, to me, at the time, very interesting fact, that in the summer of 1914, just before the assassinations, in the Foreign Office in London, the personal secretary of Sir Edward Grey, of the Foreign Secretary, was being briefed for a mission to Berlin, which was going to seek an understanding with Germany because London was planning to drop the relationship with Russia that they had signed in 1907. It was coming up for renewal in 2015, and the idea was to drop this relationship and seek instead a better understanding with Berlin. That tells you something about how open the future still was when the assassinations occurred. There are other things one can do. One can stress aspects of the events that have been underreported or underexposed. One of them that I think is particularly interesting is the Italian attack on what we now call Libya in 1911. In 1911, the Italians, without any provocation whatsoever, attacked the 3 vilayets of Cyrenaica, Tripolis, and Fezzan, which we now call Libya. This was an extremely important conflict. It was important in all kinds of ways for North Africa, and I won't go into those, but it was also very important because it flashed a green light to the Balkan states. It was a message to the Balkans saying, now is the moment to attack the Ottomans, to take what you can from the Ottoman Empire. This is a bargain basement sell-off for the Ottoman territories in Europe, and the consequence was, I mean, I'm thinking now of the comments made by Miroslav Spalajković, the Serbian head chief of the political department of the Serbian Foreign Ministry, who commented in a very interesting interview with a French journalist in 1920. He said, the Italian attack on Libya, ça c'était la première agression. That was the first aggression, and everything that came after, the Balkan Wars, the Great War, unfolded out of this first aggression, this first destabilizing aggression. So there are all sorts of ways in which you can bring aspects of pre-war events more into the light than has hitherto occurred. Okay, well, there are very many other things one can do, but I want to close basically simply by saying, because I think I'm coming to the end of my time, simply by saying that once you walk these paths, first of all by saying that this is not about exculpating the Germans. My book has sometimes been misunderstood as saying, you know, the Germans are innocent after all, hooray, they're off the hook. That's not true. The Germans, Fritz Fischer was not lying when he put together his collections of when he analyzed the German sources. He found things that were really there. He found aggression, paranoia, imperialism. The point is that Berlin was not the only place where one found aggression, paranoia, and imperialism. And what's fascinating, once you look at all of the decision-making centers in 1911, 12, 13, 14, is how very similar they are, how they mirror each other's arguments, how they mirror each other's actions. These were statesmen operating within a very similar canon of norms and behaviors. And so it seems to me that once one walks these paths, once one looks in a European way at the outbreak of this war, which was a European disaster, it became a world affair, but of course it began as a European catastrophe. And once one observes or reflects on this catastrophe in a European way, thinking of Europe as a joined-up interactive system, then it gets very difficult to fall back into the simplicities of the Fischer thesis, of a thesis that blames one particular state. There's no doubt that the blame game, the whole business of blaming a particular party for the outbreak of war, has an immense appeal. There's a moral pleasure in handing out blame. There's no question that there's a sort of moral payoff. But the problem with approaching 1914 in that way is, among other things, I mean, there are many problems with it. One of them is that you end up focusing just on one state and you lose the interactive dimension. This was an intensely interactive and very complex crisis. And another is that you end up assuming that in every conflict of interests, one party must be right and one party must be wrong. But let's think, for example, about the very bitter conflict between Serbia and Austria over Albania. The Serbs, the Austrians, supported the creation of an independent Albania. The Serbs were bitterly opposed to this because they wanted a bridgehead to the Adriatic. Now, of course, the Austrians were partly supporting Albania because they wanted to prevent the Serbs from getting to the Adriatic. But was one of these policies worse than the other? Was one of these policies wrong and the other one right? The population of this new Albanian state were, in fact, something like 98% Albanian speakers. So was one of these policies wrong and the other right? The answer is, the question is the wrong question. That's not the way that international relations happens. This was a conflict of interest, and if both parties were determined to pursue their respective interests by force of arms, then it was going to lead to military conflict. That's the way the system was unfolding before 1914, not as bad guys versus good guys, but as conflicts of interest that were steadily getting out of control. In other words, the story of how war came about in 1914 is not a James Bond movie. We don't arrive at the end of the story in a kind of mountain hideaway with villains in velvet jackets stroking a black cat with a prosthetic hand made of metal and planning world destruction. That's not the kind of story this is. The crisis of 1914 was complex. It was probably the most complex event of modern times, possibly of all times in human history. It was exceptionally interactive. It was the fruit of the system, of the European political, international diplomatic and political system, not system as a bloodless construct, but system as a gallery of actors who all shared a fundamentally similar political culture. And it was to illuminate these aspects of the crisis of 1914 and the coming of this terrible war that I wrote this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Mr. Clark. And I would like to call Mr. Christian Ingrao, the National Center for Scientific Research, First World War, the Matrix of Mass Violence. Upravo sam shvatila da sam prešla na engleski, ali vjerojatno zbog predavača. Izvolite.
Donc bonjour, je m'excuse, mais je vais parler en français. Comme c'est une langue en voie de disparition, J'essaie de lui faire un dernier tour de promotion. Alors, la Première Guerre mondiale comme matrice des violences de masse. Il faudrait pouvoir, en fait, pour traiter du sujet, il faudrait reprendre chacun des termes qui sont employés et chacun les déminer, les décapsuler. Mais au fond, on ne va pas commencer comme ça. On va essayer de suspendre l'interrogation sur la question de la Grande Guerre et la question des violences de masse, qui forment le cœur, évidemment, de la réflexion qu'on va mener ici, mais pour s'intéresser au terme qu'on a mis entre les deux, celui de matrice. Le terme de matrice est employé dans une acception classique littéraire depuis une bonne quinzaine, presque vingtaine d'années maintenant, pour caractériser la Grande Guerre comme point originant des pratiques, et notamment, mais pas seulement des pratiques de violence, observables ensuite sur tout le siècle, mais rencontrées pour la première fois de façon systématique en Europe lors du premier conflit mondial. Cet emploi du terme de matrice a été insufflé aux historiens de la Première Guerre mondiale, mais aussi à certains historiens de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, par le choc de la resurrection en Yougoslavie, dans les ex-républiques de Yougoslavie, de la guerre dans l'horizon de conscience des sociétés européennes au début des années 90 du siècle précédent. Cet usage, pour autant, pour stimulant qu'il soit, ne va pas sans interrogation. Est-ce qu'il n'enferme pas l'advenu dans l'inexorable? Ne clôt-il pas l'histoire européenne dans une sorte d'illusion rétrospective? Alors, j'aimerais arguer ici du contraire, en faisant un pas de côté dans l'acception du terme, en ne prenant pas le terme comme un terme littéraire ou littéral, mais simplement en embrassant le terme dans son sens mathématique. Alors, en mathématiques, une matrice, c'est un carré, c'est un tableau rectangulaire qui est utilisé et rempli de nombres qui sont définis, qui est utilisé par les mathématiciens pour représenter commodément, pour faire une sorte d'inventaire des opérations qu'ils effectuent sur des espaces vectoriels à n dimensions, n variant de 3 à plus l'infini. Alors, ne vous inquiétez pas, on ne va pas aller plus loin en mathématiques. Je n'irai pas plus loin parce que, tout simplement, malgré un héritage familial lourd, mes deux parents sont profs de maths, les mathématiques me sont complètement étrangères et je ne m'y aventure que de façon très prudente. Il n'en reste pas moins que ces espaces vectoriels dont on est en train de parler sont ceux qui servent aux physiciens pour décrire les phénomènes quantiques. Et qu'ils doivent, pour faire ça, utiliser ces opérations-là, ces matrices densité-là, et qu'ils doivent le faire dans une perspective qui est une version probabiliste des mathématiques. Et à cet instant précis, la matrice a retrouvé à nos yeux d'historiens ce qui en fait son principal intérêt. C'est un instrument qui permet d'explorer de manière commode le champ des possibles dynamiques, le fait que les espaces soient vectoriels oriente la chose, le temps ne s'écoule que dans un seul sens, sans masquer la dimension probabiliste, si ce n'est aléatoire, de ce qui résulte de la matrice. En clair, pour essayer d'être un peu plus compréhensif, si vous voulez, l'acception mathématique du terme de matrice nous permet d'étudier ce qui, dans la Grande Guerre, a connu une postérité remarquable, sans faire de cette postérité quelque chose de fatal, quelque chose d'inéluctable. Et donc, on peut désormais poser qu'on observe dans la Grande Guerre un certain nombre de phénomènes, de discours, de pratiques qui ont structuré le champ des possibles du 1er XXe siècle, à tout le moins en Europe. Les historiens qui sont prompts à rendre inéluctable ce qui est advenu, effectivement, mais le terme de matrice, outre qu'il nous sert désormais à rassembler dans un seul regard des choses qui sont profondément hétérogènes, nous dit aussi, donc ce terme, que le champ d'inertie généré par la guerre était immense, ce qui est né dans cette guerre a connu en effet une postérité extrêmement importante, mais que cette inertie ne rendait pas les choses inéluctables, et c'est cela qui nous intéresse dans le terme de matrice. Alors, pour essayer de reprendre tout ça, il faut en premier lieu repartir du fondement. La guerre, c'est un phénomène social, et elle réfracte les sociétés qui la mettent en œuvre. Ce qui fait matrice en premier lieu, c'est que la Grande Guerre est la première guerre d'un monde qui a connu une incroyable croissance démographique et une révolution économique et sociale qui n'a de précédent qu'au néolithique. Et c'est cela qui va en conditionner en premier lieu les caractères. De ce premier constat, nous glisserons vers l'émergence d'acteurs spécifiques de la guerre, qui tout à la fois en incarnent la spécificité et la nouveauté, et qui, dans le même temps, ne sont en 14-18 que de pâles préfigurations de ceux qui opéreront tout au long du siècle de métal qu'est le XXe siècle. Enfin, dans un dernier temps, nous tenterons de comprendre comment les corps, les âmes et les êtres ont traversé l'épreuve et en quoi la Grande Guerre a été matricielle à cet égard aussi. La guerre, donc, est un révélateur des sociétés qui la pratiquent. Leurs grandes données démographiques, économiques, sociales, géostratégiques la marquent en profondeur et constituent le cadre qui conditionne dans une large mesure les formes de l'affrontement. Les armées qui se sont combattues en 1914 sont des armées qui sont dans leur grande majorité l'émanation d'États et de populations qui ont connu des accroissements démographiques absolument inédits. Ce sont 80 millions de personnes qui vont se jeter les unes sur les autres, contre les autres, entre 1914 et 1918. Il s'agit là d'armées d'une ampleur nouvelle. La grande armée napoléonienne compte 600 000 hommes en campagne au maximum, entre 1805 et 1815. Ces effectifs-là, qui sont une armée monstrueuse au XIXe siècle, sont en fait équivalent aux effectifs combattants de l'armée française en temps de paix en 1914. L'entente, elle, entre 1914 et 1918, durant les premiers mois de la guerre, les premiers mois de 1914, a mobilisé en tout 12 522 000 hommes. Ces fourmilières humaines qui s'entrechoquent s'infligèrent mutuellement des pertes absolument inouïes. Ce sont 750 000 hommes qui furent perdus à Verdun en 1916, morts, blessés, prisonniers, portés disparus. C'était là la conséquence de l'immensité des armées dont nous sommes en train de parler, mais aussi celle de la révolution industrielle que connurent les belligérants à partir du XIXe siècle. Et ce phénomène, relativement nouveau en 1914, là est la matrice, va se diffuser pendant tout le XXe siècle. Si l'on considère désormais le XXe siècle, la Chine de Chiang Kai-shek et de Mao, le Japon du général Tojo, l'Irak de Saddam Hussein, sans parler même des États-Unis ou de l'URSS, sont suffisamment industrialisés, suffisamment riches pour entretenir ces armées massives et suréquipées qui sont la condition même des grandes hémorragies du XXe siècle. Toutes ces puissances voient prospérer, dès la Grande Guerre, de grandes entreprises, de grands concerns, produisant au moins momentanément l'armement de guerre, de Renault à Rolls-Royce, en passant par Hotchkiss, par Mitsubishi, Potez Dassault, Oerlikon, Messerschmitt, Fiat, Volkswagen, Boeing, etc., etc. Modèle presque uniquement occidental en 1914, à l'exception notable du Japon, ce triptyque qui combine la puissance démographique, l'industrialisation massive et la technologie appliquée à la puissance de feu, s'exporte, et c'est là qu'est la matrice. Ensuite, dans la seconde moitié du XXe siècle, le corollaire de ce phénomène étant que, désormais, les grandes saignées humaines qui vont s'opérer à partir de 1945 s'opèrent essentiellement en Asie et en Afrique. La guerre Iran-Irak, qui est si proche par bien des côtés, par bien des aspects de la Grande Guerre, coûte entre 800 000 et 1 200 000 vies. Insérée dans ce cadre qui structure les possibles guerriers, la guerre s'agence tout au long du siècle sous 3 formes d'affrontements qui sont loin de s'exclure les uns des autres. Elle se présente d'abord sous la forme d'une succession de batailles qui sont précédées de manœuvres qu'on dénomme guerre de mouvement. C'est le cas des premiers mois de la Grande Guerre, de loin les plus meurtriers du conflit. Et l'on retrouvera cette configuration classique lors des campagnes initiales du Troisième Reich, littéralement obsédée par la matrice du premier conflit, et notamment durant certaines périodes sur le front de l'Est entre 1941 et 1944. Extrêmement coûteuse en hommes, cette forme de guerre constituait donc, contre toute logique, l'horizon d'attente des états-majors occidentaux en 1914. Et si vous regardez l'horizon d'attente de l'état-major français intervenant au Mali l'année dernière, vous apercevez que la guerre de mouvement reste toujours le cadre et le logiciel sur lequel fonctionne la plus grande partie des armées, notamment occidentales. La Première Guerre mondiale, cependant, a marqué une évolution fondamentale dans ce modèle. En effet, l'immense puissance d'arrêt du feu moderne a réduit à néant la capacité de manœuvre des armées. Les combattants généralisèrent donc, à partir de l'hiver 1914 sur le front de l'Ouest, un système de fortification et d'abri qui figea les lignes durant près de 4 années. La guerre de position est ainsi devenue une figure très observée dans maintes conflits, notamment la guerre Iran-Irak, encore une fois, de 1979-80 jusqu'à peu près 1990, à Dien Bien Phu en 1954, ou durant l'interminable guerre civile libanaise de 1975 à 1990. Il convient bien de rappeler ici que le système des tranchées, que la guerre de position est d'abord et avant tout un système qui protège la vie des combattants. Il est enfin, un troisième type de confrontation, souvent sans ligne de front, souvent sans bataille identifiée, petite guerre où l'on court, faite d'embuscades, de coups de main, d'attentats, opposant très souvent des armées dissymétriques. On l'observe pendant la Première Guerre mondiale, notamment dans le sud-est africain, entre 1914 et 1918, ou sur certains secteurs des fronts est de la Grande Guerre. Et l'on retrouvera cette forme de conflit dans nombre de guerres, de la guerre civile russe, en passant par la guerre du Rif, les guerres d'Indochine et d'Algérie, la Seconde Guerre mondiale, je n'en parle même pas, jusqu'à, évidemment, l'Afghanistan actuel. Et ce sont donc un très grand nombre de conflits qui n'ont pas revêtu la forme de la guerre de position ou de mouvement avec des batailles identifiées. La seconde grande caractéristique qui confère à la Première Guerre mondiale son caractère matriciel réside dans le saut quantique que connaît l'armement. La puissance de feu, depuis la deuxième moitié du XIXe siècle, a été augmentée de manière absolument vertigineuse, tout à la fois en termes de cadence de tir qu'en termes de puissance des projectiles. Une mitrailleuse MG42, oui, je sais bien que c'est une mitrailleuse de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, mais une mitrailleuse comme la MG42 tire entre 1200 et 1800 coups minutes, et elle vaut à peu près 90 fusiliers. Chacun des projectiles coniques de ces nouvelles armes dépasse la vitesse du son. Ce mur de feu est infranchissable. Il ne laisse aucun survivant dans une ligne de tirailleurs partant à l'assaut. Ces derniers, les tirailleurs, ne parviendront à leur fin, ne parviendront à ressortir des tranchées qu'en avançant sous protection et couverture, en usant de la combinaison des techniques d'assaut commando et du blindage des chars, toutes inventions qui font de la Première Guerre mondiale une véritable matrice des guerres qui vont suivre. Valable pour les projections de petit calibre, pour les projectiles de petit calibre, ces observations le sont encore plus pour l'artillerie, qui devient entre 1914 et 1918 l'arme la plus mortelle du champ de bataille, pratiquement 80% de la mortalité. Désormais, et c'est là que nous pouvons discuter du caractère matriciel de la Grande Guerre et de ses limites. Désormais, même cette artillerie a été remplacée dans les guerres actuelles par l'aviation, qui est certes née au sein de la Grande Guerre, mais aussi et surtout désormais par le missile et par le drone, qui viennent compléter cette panoplie et l'évolution de la guerre, permettant à des êtres humains d'en tuer d'autres à des milliers de kilomètres de distance, avec une intensité et une précision remarquables. Les bombardements stratégiques observés durant le second conflit mondial, mais aussi la guerre du Vietnam, constituent l'une des grandes caractéristiques de la violence de guerre, un paroxysme étant atteint, évidemment, avec les 2 bombardements atomiques américains sur le Japon. Si cette évolution était en germe pendant la Première Guerre mondiale, en témoigne le bombardement de Londres par les Zeppelins, mais aussi le bombardement de Freiburg-im-Breisgau par les avions français, rien ne dit, en 1918, que scintillera ce feu inoubliable dont parlait le groupe de rock U2 en revenant d'Hiroshima. C'est ici qu'on voit qu'il y a matrice, mais qu'on reste dans le probable et l'aléatoire. Il est enfin un dernier type d'innovation absolument déterminant. Les nations en guerre en 1914 ont inventé de nouvelles formes de gestion des hommes et de mobilisation des ressources qui ont joué un rôle déterminant durant tout le siècle. Gestion de centaines de milliers de réfugiés mis sur les routes par les combats. Je rappelle que Peter Gatrell avait dénombré 100 000 réfugiés en 1914 à Varsovie. Administration des prisonniers de guerre, 3 millions de prisonniers de guerre soviétiques entre les mains des Allemands en 1941. Organisation de la production d'armement en masse. Mobilisation de ce que les Occidentaux appellent maintenant les cœurs et les esprits. Sous l'égide des États, ce sont bien l'ensemble des ressources, en hommes, en biens et en énergie, qui ont été engagés dans les brasiers guerriers du XXe siècle, à l'exemple de 1914-1918, à l'exemple de la Grande Guerre. Dans de telles guerres, aussi intenses, aussi meurtrières, les belligérants engagèrent la totalité de leurs ressources et de leur être. Alors que les combattants sont traditionnellement jeunes, des hommes jeunes en âge de porter des armes, on observe sur le siècle une tendance lourde à la transgression de la barrière de l'âge et du genre, sensible dès 1914. Qui se souvient que Rudolf Höss, le futur commandant d'Auschwitz, est un ancien engagé volontaire à 15 ans, pendant la Grande Guerre. Qui se souvient qu'Erich von der Bartzelewski, dont je parlais avec le professeur Clark tout à l'heure, lui aussi, qui deviendra le bourreau de la Biélorussie, fut engagé à 16 ans, lui aussi, comme engagé volontaire pendant la Première Guerre mondiale. Bien sûr, ce genre d'enfants soldats, d'enfants guerriers, était de l'exception encore en 1914 parmi les armées belligérantes. On s'aperçoit très bien que s'ils étaient l'exception en 1914-1918, ils le sont beaucoup moins pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale, et ils sont devenus la règle en Sierra Leone, ou au Libéria, ou dans la région des Grands Lacs, pour les conflits de la fin du XXe siècle. Là encore, il y a un caractère matriciel à tout cela. Tous ainsi peuvent devenir combattants. L'armée du désespoir nazi, dont je vous parlais tout à l'heure, est composée de vieillards, d'enfants et de vétérans en 1945. Et cette armée ne sera pas moins effective que l'armée qui a essayé de partir à l'assaut de l'URSS en 1941. C'est une armée qui perdra 2 500 000 hommes entre juillet 1944 et 1945. Ce désespoir dont nous sommes en train de parler, qui paraît si spécifique au national-socialisme en 1944-45, ne l'est en fait pas du tout. Quand vous regardez les plans qu'en octobre 1918, Walter Rathenau envisageait après l'échec des grandes offensives allemandes, il envisageait des solutions de défense en profondeur basées sur la terre brûlée, avec l'armement des populations de l'ouest de l'Allemagne. Et cette utopie du désespoir qui était celle de Rathenau a été réalisée par les nazis en 1944-45. C'est dire, encore une fois, le caractère matriciel de la Première Guerre mondiale. Alors que la guerre traditionnelle est dictée, sans toutefois évidemment toujours la respecter, la norme de l'exclusion des femmes de la violence de guerre, les violences dirigées contre elles ont tendance à se généraliser aussi sur le siècle. Le viol de guerre, on le voit très bien apparaître entre 1914 et 1918. Sur le front de l'Ouest, Stéphane Rousseau a travaillé là-dessus. Sur les fronts de l'Est, de façon beaucoup plus prégnante. Mais ce viol de guerre, il s'est tellement systématisé à partir évidemment des guerres, des conflits en ex-Yougoslavie à partir de 1990, et bien sûr hors d'Europe, dans la région des Grands Lacs africains des années 1990-2000. La grande indifférenciation qu'on est en train de dessiner ici, effondrement de la barrière du genre, effondrement de la barrière de l'âge, elle connaît une tragique illustration. Les civils n'étaient pas encore massivement une cible directe prioritaire en 1914, à quelques exceptions, exception de quelques occurrences sur le front de l'Est, dans les Balkans notamment, et évidemment, bien sûr, entre 1914 et 1918, dans l'Empire ottoman, avec le cas génocidaire arménien de 1915. Mais hormis ces exceptions-là, les civils ne sont pas encore une cible prioritaire pour les puissances belligérantes et occupantes. Bien sûr, à partir de 1939, les civils sont désormais devenus la cible principale, avec le bombardement stratégique de Dresde à Hanoï en passant par Hiroshima, mais aussi, il ne faut pas l'oublier, le massacre indifférencié en Biélorussie, 627 Oradour, 627 villages brûlés, habitants complis, entre juin 1941 et juin 1944. Et évidemment, le dernier cas qu'on peut citer, c'est bien sûr les fédéraux russes qui, en 1995, quand ils reprennent Grozny, tuent 27 000 civils en 6 mois. Je vous rappelle que Srebrenica, c'est 7 000 morts, Grozny, c'est 27 000. Et évidemment, les consciences occidentales n'ont pas paru très, très touchées et très, très émotionnées par tout cela. Mais au-delà du principe moral, ce que j'aimerais montrer ici, c'est que ça montre bien en fait la banalisation de cette totalisation-là. Les guerres sont devenues totales, les civils sont une cible prioritaire, et c'est devenu tellement banal que les chancelleries s'en émeuvent de moins en moins. Sous le coup de ces bouleversements, la figure du combattant a connu une mutation fondamentale. Au-delà même de l'avènement puis de l'effacement relatif après 1945 de la figure du soldat citoyen conscrit, l'une des questions qui semble travailler le siècle dans le sillage de la guerre est la suivante. Qu'est-ce qu'il peut bien rester d'Hector ou d'Achille lorsque leur corps se volatilise sous l'effet des obus de gros calibre, quand leur silhouette manchotte ou cul-de-jatte ou leur gueule cassée hantent les sociétés d'après-guerre? La question a atteint l'Europe si profondément qu'on ne saurait tenter dans ces quelques lignes d'en prendre la mesure. Si la posture héroïque sacrificielle a connu hors du continent, hors de l'Europe, sur tout le siècle, un maintien et peut-être même une résurgence, en raison notamment de l'émergence de combattants suicidaires, le kamikaze japonais, le pilote de la Luftwaffe en 1944, mais aussi le Mujahid Taleb ou le Basij iranien, ou le tigre sri-lankais. Il n'en reste pas moins qu'à l'échelle globale, si vous voulez, la figure du combattant a connu une très nette déshéroïsation sur le siècle. Et ce d'autant que deux nouvelles figures sont abattues, le milicien et l'abatteur, qui ont altéré très profondément la figure du combattant. On en saisit les prodromes dans la matrice de 1941, précisément sur le front Est, avec les milices bulgares, avec les supplétifs ottomans, qui ne sont employés que dans l'agression contre les civils. Et la question se pose ensuite avec une acuité tragique à l'extrême. Compte en effet de combattants, les policiers des Einsatzgruppen qui exterminent les Juifs devant des fosses en URSS, compte de combattants, les soldats du ministère de l'Intérieur serbe exécutant des hommes à Srebrenica à la mi-juillet 1995. Pas grand-chose. Avec la technicisation et la totalisation du conflit, les figures de l'aviateur, du sous-marinier et de l'artilleur, toutes sorties de la Grande Guerre et systématisées après, sont enfin venues compléter la figure du combattant fantassin et cavalier. Fantassin et cavalier, pardonnez-moi. Ils mènent une guerre à distance, aux effets souvent édulcorés dans leur expérience. Ils sont enfin, par ailleurs, désormais accompagnés de l'ingénieur social qui administre les populations, qu'il s'agisse de les gouverner, de les nourrir, de les exploiter, de les regrouper, de les affamer, de les spolier ou de les expulser. Cette nouvelle figure de l'ingénieur social, apparue de manière impressionniste durant la Première Guerre mondiale, notamment dans la Ober-Heeresleitung, les politiques d'occupation allemandes dans le Nord-Est, cette nouvelle figure se retrouve donc dans nombre de conflits des officiers SS des services de colonisation nazis en Pologne, au Provincial Reconstruction Team de l'ISAF, des forces de l'OTAN en Afghanistan, en passant par les SAS de l'armée française en Algérie. Cette figure de l'ingénieur social a connu enfin une incarnation spécifique et absolue dans la fusion des figures de l'ingénieur d'un côté et de l'abatteur de l'autre dans les usines de mort nazies de l'opération Reinhardt et d'Auschwitz. Doit-on pour autant tirer un trait rectiligne d'une guerre à l'autre? La question se pose, certes, mais on n'y répondra pas de façon convaincante dans les quelques minutes qui suivent. On l'aura compris, jamais les corps n'auront autant souffert durant ce siècle. L'indice le plus sûr de cet état de fait est que la médecine pastorienne triomphante de la faune microbienne connaît une immense défaite initiale face au trauma, à la traumatologie de la guerre de 1914. Effet de souffle, trauma calorifique, membres arrachés, os éclatés, lésions internes pulmonaires, abdominales, crâne enfoncé. Les délabrements corporels sont tellement importants, les corps sont tellement dilacérés que le saisissement médical est complet au début de la guerre. Évidemment, après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, la situation s'inverse, mais il n'en reste pas moins que les hideuses cicatrices laissées sur les corps constituent une trace éloquente de ce que fut l'expérience de guerre. Les corps, enfin, se volatilisèrent énormément en Grande Guerre. Et ils connaissent tragiquement durant tout le siècle, qu'il s'agisse de ceux des combattants ou des victimes civiles, pulvérisés par les bombardements, réduits en cendres dans les brasiers, enterrés en masse dans les charniers, les corps sont le point de cristallisation de ce que la guerre produit d'absence. La disparition constitue en effet peut-être un héritage central de l'expérience de guerre et son institution aura marqué un certain nombre de conflits. Inventé par les Allemands durant la Seconde Guerre mondiale avec le décret Nacht und Nebel, la disparition des personnes suspend les êtres entre le mort et le vif, en une espèce de tératologie, de monstruosité traumatogène pour les sociétés qui les perçoivent, comme on peut le voir dans les exemples algériens de 1957-1962 ou argentins des années 70-80. Les premières personnes à disparaître véritablement, missing in action, le sont pendant la Grande Guerre. C'est ici aussi qu'il faut cependant questionner le rôle matriciel de la Grande Guerre. Les Allemands ont mis en place effectivement des pratiques d'occupation qui présupposaient l'escamotage et le déplacement des populations, mais on ne peut pas, à ma connaissance, soutenir qu'ils avaient déjà en tête la transgression que constitue la disparition. À l'abéance des corps répond celle des âmes, par ailleurs. L'immensité des blessures narcissiques, invisibles, subies par les individus, mais aussi les groupes sociaux, constitue, si ce n'est une terra incognita, du moins un continent dont l'exploration est toujours à recommencer. Génératrice, cette béance des âmes, génératrice de comportements suicidaires, addictifs, transgressifs, les pathologies maladroitement regroupées aujourd'hui dans le DSM-4 sous le vocable de Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder constituent un héritage durable des conflits. Il en est sans doute de même avec cette défloration de l'âme que constituent les comportements et situations identifiés par les combattants et même chez certains d'entre eux comme déviants et pervers, le sadisme, la cruauté. Très souvent captés dans les conflits postérieurs à 1914-1918 par les belligérants dans les séquences de torture ou de violences démonstratrices, les pratiques de cruauté génèrent en effet chez de nombreux individus des comportements transgressifs qu'en vain les sociétés belligérantes ont tenté de limiter, voire de sanctionner. Il est temps cependant de conclure maintenant. La Grande Guerre a bien été, je pense, le creuset de pratiquement tous les possibles guerriers qui ont pris corps dans les conflits qui ont scandé le XXe siècle et dont rien, au fond, évidemment, l'Ukraine nous le dit tout de suite, dont rien, au fond, ne peut nous dire que le fil s'est interrompu. La séquence, simplement, a semblé jusqu'ici se continuer ailleurs, sur d'autres continents. Et il est une question qu'ici on n'a pas encore abordée, celui de la Grande Guerre comme matrice de bouleversement politique majeur de ce siècle, comme le disait le professeur Clark. Celui de régimes importants dans des sociétés de paix, des projets politiques marqués au sceau de l'expérience de guerre. Nazisme, fascisme, stalinisme ont tous une filiation avec la Grande Guerre et sont tout à la fois dans leurs assignations idéologiques, dans leurs pratiques étatiques, et dans la mise en place de pratiques de mise en ordre, de répression sociale, ethnique, raciale ou genrée, et de développement de mondes carcéraux spécifiques. Ne pourrait-on dire qu'ils ont, en fin de compte, mené des politiques de mobilisation semblables à celles de la guerre totale née de la Grande Guerre, voire peut-être simplement des politiques d'occupation en temps de paix dans leur propre pays? Là encore, la Grande Guerre a joué pratiquement partout un rôle matriciel, même si, en ce qui concerne le génocide des Juifs dans des installations fixes de gazage, la filiation est mémorielle et ne concerne pas les pratiques de mise à mort marquées au sceau d'un inédit et d'une unicité incontestable. Un mot pour conclure vraiment maintenant. Il est une caractéristique dont la visibilité est ambiguë et qui surgit de 1914 pour traverser pratiquement tout le siècle, tragiquement, le traverser de part en part, et qui fait figure d'universel. C'est le deuil de masse. Le deuil envahit tout. Les vêtements crêpés de noir en 1918, les consciences tordues de chagrin, les traités inégalitaires, mais aussi la rage des combattants alors que leur ennemi a rendu les armes. C'est au fond là que se situe peut-être la plus grande subversion de la violence de guerre et incontestablement l'héritage le plus tenace de la Grande Guerre qui circule, contamine, travaille en profondeur les sociétés durant la Grande Guerre et dans l'après, cet après dont nous sommes évidemment inexorablement les héritiers. L'expérience si particulière du deuil de guerre est si massive et si peu dite, celle qui fait que les pères enterrent les fils et qu'ils ne savent plus répondre à Paul de Tarse qui interroge « Ubi est mors victoria tua » « Ô mort, où est ta victoire ?» Je vous remercie.